Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. If you're watching this late at night, this video series is part of the unit Conflict, Canadians at War. The topic of today is World War II, and the part is Part 1, Introduction and Significance. What is the significance of World War II to Canada and the world? This is a huge topic with massive ramification and significance for many interesting reasons. This topic is often popular among many students, but not all students, and many students ask why we cannot spend more time of the course on this topic. An appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping that it will eat him last. Winston Churchill. This quote is credited to Winston Churchill. However, it is a simplified and edited paraphrase, which highlights why it is important to research your quotes well. Google information about the quotes that you want to use. Each one hopes that if he feeds the crocodile enough, the crocodile will eat him last. All of them hope that the storm will pass before their turn comes to be devoured. But I fear greatly that the storm will not pass. It will rage and it will roar. Ever more loudly, ever more wildly, Churchill. He spoke in a radio broadcast that was quoted in the New York Times. However, you can see that paraphrase is shorter, simpler, and focuses on only one metaphor for the sake of simplicity. We learn from this quote the value of researching our sources. Starting questions. Was Churchill correct in his assertion that the conflict of World War II could not be avoided? We will wait 10 seconds. We will pause for 5 minutes. In 10 seconds we'll pause for 5 minutes. I'm going to ask you to step 1, brainstorm 3 of your own questions on a piece of paper. And then step 2, share your own questions with a partner and discuss the questions on the slide with a partner. Are your questions open or closed? Okay, pause now. Hit the pause button. Do 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 do. Okay, restart the video. Continuing on. Why and how was Churchill correct? Do most people now accept this as a common sense truth? How could we evaluate and judge the time in history that the war might have been avoided? What were the causes of the rise of Hitler in Germany? And the rise of totalitarianism, militarism, and imperialism in the other Axis nations? What were the causes of the war? Canadian connection. William Lyon Mackenzie King was hoping for appeasement to bring peace. On page 101 of Counterpoints, Cranny wrote, he desperately had hoped that Britain's policy of appeasement towards Hitler would be successful. In a 1948 speech, Winston Churchill paraphrased George Santayana, those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. This quote is appropriate for the context of studying World War II because we do not want to repeat the tragedy of World War II. We must remember this history and we must learn from this history for the sake of the future. Pause to remember. Over 45,000 Canadians died. Did you know that Canadian civilians died on sea ships in the Atlantic? For further research, Google Merchant Marines. Pause to remember. Did you know that some children lost their parents in the war? Google Daddy Wait For Me and find out this family's full story. It's a Canadian story. Wait For Me Daddy is an iconic photo taken by Claude P. Detloff on October 1st, 1940 of the British Columbia Regiment. Marching down 8th Street, at the Columbia Street intersection, Newestminster, British Columbia, Canada. Pictured are 5-year-old Warren Whitty Bernard and his parents Bernice and Jack Bernard, as the family was about to be separated by the war. The picture received extensive exposure. 5-year-old Warren Whitty Bernard was in grade 1 at nearby General Wolfe Elementary. Whitty's dad was enlisted in the British Columbia Regiment, and finally, after months of waiting, the regiment received word that it was moving to a secret destination overseas. As the troops marched to a waiting train to take them to their next destination, photographer Claude P. Detloff of the province newspaper positioned himself to photograph the whole column marching down the hill. As he was getting ready to take the picture, he saw a young boy run out onto the road, the mother's outstretched hand, and the swirl of her coat. The boy's shock of white hair and his own reaching hand, the father's turning smile, and the downward thrust of his own outreaching hand. He has shifted his rifle to his other hand to hold his son's for a moment. The long line of marching men in the background. All this makes an unforgettable image, a masterpiece of unplanned composition, a heart-grabbing moment frozen for all time. This picture Detloff captured was picked up all over the world, getting exposure in Life magazine. It hung in every school in British Columbia during the war. Wait for Me, Daddy, 1940. Pause to remember. On the right side is a Canadian soldier with a child. On the bottom left side, there are famous images from Nanking, World War II. What I want you to do with these photos is take a moment in time to pause and remember deeply by walking in someone else's shoes. What would it be like to feel like you need to fight for your family, for your children? The statement of inquiry for this unit is: major global conflicts cause significant shifts in beliefs, perspectives, and identities. I'll read that twice. The statement of inquiry for this unit is: major global conflicts cause significant shifts in beliefs, perspectives, and identities. How did World War II cause significant shifts in beliefs, perspectives, and identities? How did World War II cause significant shifts in belief, perspectives, and identities? That's the same idea in question form. How did the Cold War cause significant shifts in beliefs, perspectives, and identities? How did the Rwandan genocide and the Canadian involvement cause significant shifts in beliefs, perspectives, and identities? BC Socials 10, Curricular Competencies. We will also consider significance, ethical judgments, perspective, and cause and consequence, as well as other big ideas and historical thinking. Assess the significance of people, places, and events and developments, and compare varying perspectives on their significance at particular times and places from group to group. Significance. That is significance. Next, explain and infer different perspectives on past and or present people, places, issues, or events by considering prevailing norms, values, worldviews, and beliefs. That is perspective. Assess how underlying conditions and the actions of individuals or groups influence events, decisions, developments, and analyze multiple consequences. That is cause and consequence. Also, ethical judgments. Make reasoned ethical judgments about actions in the past and present and assess appropriate ways to remember and respond. Now, if that last slide seemed full and complicated, then here it is again, a little bit simplified. I'll slow down a little bit here. Here are some of the simplified questions to help us consider significance, perspective, and the causes and consequences. 1. Why is this significant? 2. What are the different perspectives? 3. How did beliefs, people, events, and other causes shape decisions and action? 4. What is your opinion and recommendation? All of these ideas overlap to the 5 C's of historical thinking: change over time, context, causality, contingency, and complexity. What does it mean to think historically? I have included a link here for students who will get access to this PowerPoint so they can click on the link and have easy access to this source. We will also need to wrestle with some facts and opinions are mixed with exaggeration, bias, perspective, point of view, full lies, half lies, honest mistakes, incomplete truth, simplification, and propaganda. Propaganda! Bias and perspective can also be very conscious and sometimes subconscious, shaped by culture, vocabulary, and commonly accepted narratives. A common poster quote is, "Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is perspective, not the truth." This is attributed to Marcus Aurelius. This quote is possibly an oversimplified translation of an older translation, or this is an old-fashioned and poor translation. Marcus Aurelius' view was that there were no facts. Rather, he believed that there are facts, but that properly understood, none of the facts of the external world should disturb us. The emperor was a Stoic, not a skeptic. If something is accepted as a fact, then we should consider the quantity and quality of the evidence to support the fact. Consider the bias in movies, documentaries, and all media. Sources of media will be flavored by overt opinion and subtle cultural perspectives. Many movies and documentaries on this topic. There are so many. Why is World War II a very popular topic in media? Because of the narrative, the conflict, the characters, and the dramatic tension. In the time period of World War II is full of so many narratives. The amount of media is evidence of the popularity of this topic on the human psyche. There are many narratives in World War II, too many to cover in this course. On page 279 of our textbook, Creating Canada mentions the book Women Heroes of World War II. 26 stories of espionage, sabotage, resistance, and rescue. 26 stories. This book also contains more sources to further research. On page 297, our textbook, Creating Canada, highlights the story of Sergeant Tommy Price of the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation in Manitoba, Canada. We will come back to Tommy Price in a different video. Many of these stories connect with the overarching World War II narrative of good versus evil. Democracy, freedom, and human rights on the side of the Allies take a stand against the aggressive invasions of the Axis on the side of tyranny, fascism, and racism, and totalitarian state control. Who are the heroes of this story? Who are the freedom fighters? And if heroes have a flaw, does that discredit the hero? Are heroes allowed not to be perfect? fiction about World War II can also influence other fiction, not directly about World War II, which can then further shape our culture. World War II is a significant historical event in an ongoing good versus evil narrative desired by fiction. Many consumers of fiction not only want a story of good versus evil, but they also want a neat and simple conclusion to the conflict with a happy ending. But not every story in history has a happy ending. Novels, movies, comics, and pop culture crave a story about good winning over evil, and Hitler fits the role of a villain. Many modern thinking constructs are influenced by World War II. However, consider an exception to the Hollywood pattern in the ideas from the unconventional novel 1984. The novel 1984 critiques the narrative that one particular nation and their allies are on the side of good, democracy, and freedom. However, World War II could be one of the best arguments for the narrative about the forces of good, democracy, and freedom and human rights fighting against tyranny, racism, and evil. But there are some details to consider. Many details. In Crash Course World War II World History, John Green very respectfully argues that this narrative does not stand up to scrutiny. How could someone make an argument for each side of that debate? Does the narrative of democracy and freedom fighting against tyranny stand up to scrutiny? It is important to recognize that this is debatable and there are arguments on both sides of the debate. On page 128 of our older 2001 textbook Counterpoints, Craney includes a quote that starts with, "It was a good war," period, and continues on. Read that quote in context for homework, page 128. Okay, one may argue there were many details and facts that contradict the narrative. However, the narrative of freedom versus tyranny. However, change was in the motion as people wrestled with the disconnect between the narrative and the reality. The difference where they don't line up. The good news, the happy ending, the positive outcome is this. The dissonance between the narrative and the reality caused reflection and change in the minds of many people. And with enough people changing their minds, governments could then change laws and change human rights for the better. One example of progress towards human rights is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, following shortly after the heels of World War II in 1948. Another argument is that democracy, freedom, and human rights are still a work in progress, and just because this work is not yet finished does not completely nullify the work of the people working to make the world a better place. A Canadian connection to this process is that Canadian laws changed, voting rights changed in Canada, and human rights improved in Canada. We'll come back to that. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights followed so closely after World War II, which shows a connecting strand between the two events. Since it was Franklin Roosevelt's widow who played a key leadership role, it shows an aspect of the narrative to be valid, at least in the minds of some people who are working hard to bring the ideals of freedom, human rights, and democracy into the lives of more people. Canada, the United States, and other countries would need to reflect and change in order change their own ideas and laws and practices to slowly become more in line with this document. I will come back to this in a few slides. In its preamble and in Article 1, the Declaration unequivocally proclaims the inherent rights of all human beings. Disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. And the Advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Another Canadian connection. Here comes the next Canadian connection. The first several drafts of the Declaration were written by a Canadian law professor, Peter Humphrey, at the request of Eleanor Roosevelt. For homework, read pages 325 and 327 of our textbook Creating Canada to learn more about this very interesting story. Many people reflected about racism and civil rights. Many people reflected about colonialism in philosophy and practice. The change in the decades after World War II, perhaps caused in part by the wrestling between ideas in the narrative and the disconnect, might be the key to understanding the significance of World War II. The events of World War II is often separated from the events of the civil rights movement, but how interconnected were they? The years following World War II had significant change. First Nations got the right to vote. 1960 for status Indians in Canada. Chinese Canadians got the right to vote in 1947. How do you think this might have been connected to World War II? This is so incredibly significant that it should not be lost or forgotten in Canadian history. World War II changed Canada. The Canadian Civil Rights Movement was connected to World War II. This was significant. However, it was such a big change that we'll need to come back to this topic in Unit 4. Here are some of the big ideas that we'll only partially discuss now, and we'll need to continue in Unit 4. 1. Global and regional conflicts have been a powerful force in shaping our contemporary world and identities. I'll repeat that. Global and regional conflicts have been a powerful force in shaping our contemporary world and identities. And number 2, historical and contemporary injustices challenge the narrative and identity of Canada as an inclusive, multicultural society. Another significant topic is the nature of war and peace. Many people reflected about systems and institutions related to peace, defense, and war. United Nations, NATO, and more. In Canada and the United States, there was a departure in the thinking from appeasement and isolationism towards the benefits of NATO and the United Nations. Do you agree or disagree with some of what Sun Tzu said in The Art of War? In peace, prepare for war. In war, prepare for peace. The art of war is of vital importance to the state. It is a matter of life and death. A road either to safety or to ruin. Hence, under no circumstance can it be neglected. And another quote. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. World War II led quickly into the time of the Cold War without much delay. The time period of the Cold War, decolonization, and civil rights movements are all intertwined. There was a change of superpowers as well from 1914 to 1982. Imagine the country with the greatest navy and the largest empire. In 1914, that was Great Britain, not the United States of America. Changing opportunities along the road towards more equality. Women had more opportunities and a massive chance to rethink traditional roles. Veronica Foster was popularly known as Ronnie the Brain Gun Girl. Veronica Foster Garrett, second World War icon, model, vocalist, born in Montreal, Quebec. Foster worked for the John Inglis Company, assembling brand light machine guns during the Second World War. Veronica Foster, also known as Ronnie the Brain Gun Girl, is and was a Canadian equivalent of Rosie the Riveter. She, Veronica Foster, was featured on propaganda posters that encouraged women to serve Canada by working in munition factories. Foster became a Canadian icon representing female workers in the manufacturing industry. Can you see which images are Canadian and American? Ronnie and Rosie. Questions. Factual. What were the causes of the Second World War? For speed, we will go fast on these slides. How did the concept of total war change the way war was fought at this time? How can we evaluate events in a wartime conflict? Example, can the targeting of civilians be justified for military reasons? How did global interactions from World War II affect perspectives, identities, and relationships that led to decolonization and other post-war events? This is here to show students this source. We will skip this today. To be continued. That is the end of part 1. In the next video, we will come back to World War II, key events in the lead up to the war. World War II. How did Hitler rise to power? And what was the Canadian reaction? That's a cut.